Victoria Sterling had built her empire on the belief that success was binary, you either mattered or you didn't. From her glass tower, she watched ordinary people scurry below like ants, convinced their small lives held no consequence. But one night, while working late in her pristine office, she would encounter a quiet janitor whose weathered hands carried stories that would shatter everything she thought she knew about worth, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be somebody. Sometimes, the most powerful truths come from the most unexpected places, wrapped in work uniforms and hidden behind humble smiles. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The elevator hummed its way to the 42nd floor, carrying Victoria Sterling toward another late night in her glass cathedral of commerce. Through the polished steel doors, she caught her reflection-sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of composed perfection that had built Sterling Industries from a single patent into a tech empire worth $12 billion. The doors parted with a whisper. The executive floor stretched before her in pristine silence, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a view of Manhattan that cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. Her heels clicked against imported marble as she moved toward her corner office, each step echoing with the authority of someone who had never learned to walk quietly. She paused. A cart sat in the hallway outside her office, industrial gray, loaded with cleaning supplies and worn rags. The sight irritated her like a wrinkle in silk. "Excuse me." Her voice cut through the silence. From behind her office door emerged a man in his 60s, wearing the navy uniform of the building's cleaning crew. He was shorter than she remembered, with silver hair that had been carefully combed despite the late hour. His name tag read, Miguel. "I'm sorry, Miss Sterling. I didn't expect. You're cleaning my office?" "Yes, ma'am. Tuesday and Friday evenings, as scheduled." Victoria's jaw tightened. She had specifically requested that her office be cleaned only when she wasn't present. The idea of sharing her space, even temporarily, with someone whose life consisted of emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces felt like an invasion. "I'll be working late tonight. You'll have to come back tomorrow." Miguel nodded, already reaching for his cart. "Of course, I apologize. And next time, check with my assistant before entering my office." "I don't appreciate surprises." Something flickered across the man's face so brief she almost missed it. Not anger exactly. Disappointment, maybe. Or recognition. Understood. He wheeled his cart toward the elevator, and Victoria noticed the careful way he moved, as if his left leg carried old pain. She pushed the observation away and entered her office, sealing herself behind heavy oak doors. The space breathed luxury and control. Her desk, a single piece of black walnut that had cost more than most cars, sat positioned to command views of both the city and anyone who dared to approach. Awards lined the walls. Forbes covers, industry recognitions, photographs with presidents and prime ministers. She settled into her leather chair and opened her laptop, diving into quarterly projections that would determine the fate of 3 subsidiary companies and the livelihoods of their employees. Numbers flowed across her screen like a digital river, each figure representing decisions that would ripple through thousands of lives. The work consumed her for hours. It always did. The rest of the world faded until there was only the clean logic of profit margins and market positioning, the addictive clarity of problems that could be solved with sufficient intelligence and ruthless precision. When she finally looked up, the city had transformed. Streetlights created rivers of gold through the darkness, and the late-night energy of Manhattan pulsed 42 floors below. Her phone showed 11:47 p.m. She closed her laptop and gathered her things, ready to retreat to her penthouse, where solitude waited like an old friend. But as she stepped into the hallway, she found Miguel still there. He wasn't cleaning. He sat on a bench near the elevators, staring out at the city through the massive windows. His cart rested beside him, forgotten. In his weathered hands, he held something small and metallic that caught the ambient light. "I thought you left hours ago." He looked up, startled. Quickly, he closed his hand around whatever he'd been holding. "Double shift tonight. covering for Rodriguez's daughters in the hospital. Victoria frowned. The information felt unnecessary, personal in a way that made her uncomfortable. She didn't need to know about the private dramas of people whose names she'd never bothered to learn. Well, don't let me keep you from your work. She moved toward the elevator, but Miguel's voice stopped her. Ms. Sterling? She turned, eyebrows raised in a way that suggested her patience was finite. I've been cleaning this building for 7 years, your office for 3. And? You've never once looked at me. Not really. The statement hung in the air between them like a challenge. Victoria felt heat rise in her chest, not quite anger, but something close to it. I beg your pardon? You look through me, like I'm part of the furniture, like I don't exist. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, its doors opening to reveal an empty car lined with mirrors. Victoria could see herself reflected infinitely, each image slightly smaller than the last, stretching into darkness. Mr. She glanced at his name tag. Miguel. I treat all employees with appropriate professionalism. If you have concerns about your working conditions, I suggest you speak with building management. That's not what I meant. Then I'm afraid I don't understand what you're trying to say. Miguel stood slowly, his left leg betraying him with a slight grimace. When he looked at her again, there was something different in his eyes. Not deference, not anger. Something harder to define. You think because you sit up here in your glass tower, surrounded by all this? He gestured at the marble and mahogany, the imported fixtures and original artwork. You think that makes you important, that makes you matter. Victoria's professional mask slipped for just a moment. Excuse me? You look at people like me and you see nothing, invisible, worthless. That's enough. But Miguel continued, his voice growing quieter rather than louder, which somehow made it more unsettling. You think success is measured in dollars and square footage? You think the size of your office determines the size of your worth? I think, Victoria said, her voice sharp as winter air, that you're overstepping your boundaries. Significantly. She stepped into the elevator, but Miguel's next words followed her like smoke. I used to think like that too, before I learned what actually matters. The doors began to close, but something made Victoria reach out and stop them. Maybe it was the tone of his voice, or the way he'd said, before, as if it marked a watershed moment that divided his life into distinct chapters. What's that supposed to mean? Miguel looked down at his closed fist, then back at her. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The city hummed around them, 42 floors of commerce and ambition and human striving, but in the small space between the elevator and the hallway, everything felt suspended. Nothing, Miss Sterling. Have a good evening. He turned away, reaching for his cart, and something about the gesture, the careful way he moved, the dignity he maintained, despite her dismissal, made Victoria feel unexpectedly small. She let the elevator doors close. But as the car descended through the building's steel spine, carrying her away from the confrontation and back toward the comfortable isolation of her penthouse, she couldn't shake the image of Miguel's hands. The way he'd held something small and precious, protecting it from her sight. The way he'd looked at her when he said she'd never really looked at him. The elevator deposited her in the marble lobby, past the security desk, where a lone guard nodded respectfully. Outside, her driver waited with the Bentley, engine purring, ready to whisk her away to a world where questions like Miguel's never intruded. But for the first time in years, Victoria found herself walking instead. The September air carried hints of autumn, and the city moved around her with its endless, restless energy. She walked north along Fifth Avenue, past boutiques where her monthly spending could fund a teacher's salary, past restaurants where she'd hosted dinners that sealed deals worth millions. She'd built this life deliberately, brick by brick, and decision by decision. Every choice had been calculated to maximize her power, her influence, her insulation from the chaos and need that seemed to define most people's existence. So why did an old janitor's words feel like they'd found some crack in her armor? She thought about the way he'd moved, the careful dignity of someone carrying old pain. She thought about his voice when he'd mentioned Rodriguez's daughter in the hospital, not gossiping, just explaining why duty had kept him working a double shift, and she thought about the small object in his hands, the way he'd protected it from her curious gaze, as if it held secrets too precious for casual display. By the time she reached her building, Victoria had made a decision that surprised even her. Tomorrow, she would stay late again, and this time she would look. Victoria arrived at the office the next evening with unusual anticipation, though she couldn't quite name what she expected to find. The 42nd floor welcomed her with its familiar silence, but tonight the quiet felt different, charged with possibility rather than mere solitude. She worked with unusual distraction, her attention drifting from spreadsheets to the hallway beyond her office door. When she heard the soft rattle of Miguel's cart at precisely 9:30 p.m., her pulse quickened in a way that annoyed her. She waited. The knock came 10 minutes later, soft, respectful. "Come in." Miguel entered with his cart, moving with the same careful dignity she'd noticed the night before. But tonight, Victoria found herself actually seeing him. The way his uniform was pressed, despite its age. The precision with which he'd arranged his supplies. The small crucifix that hung from a thin chain around his neck. "Good evening, Miss Sterling. I can come back if you prefer." "No, please. Continue with your work." He paused, clearly surprised by her civil tone, then nodded and began his routine. Victoria pretended to focus on her laptop while watching him from her peripheral vision. He worked methodically, without waste or hurry. When he emptied her wastebasket, she noticed he separated the recyclables without being asked. When he cleaned her windows, he paid particular attention to the corners where dust accumulated unnoticed. There was something almost meditative about his movements, a quiet competence that spoke of decades spent taking pride in work that others might dismiss as menial. "Miguel?" He looked up from wiping down her conference table. "Yes, ma'am?" "Last night, you said you used to think differently. About success, about what matters." His hands stilled on the table's surface. For a moment, she thought he might not answer. "Everyone thinks differently when they're young," he said finally. "What changed your mind?" Miguel straightened slowly, considering her question with the gravity of someone who'd learned to choose his words carefully. "May I ask why you want to know?" The question caught her off guard. When was the last time someone had asked her to explain her curiosity? When was the last time anyone had questioned her at all? "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Something about what you said." It stayed with me. He studied her face as if looking for signs of mockery or condescension. Finding none, he seemed to reach some internal decision. "I had a son." The simple statement landed between them with unexpected weight. Victoria waited. "Danny, he was everything to me after his mother died. Smart as a whip, full of dreams about changing the world." Miguel's voice carried the careful tenderness of someone handling precious, fragile things. "He wanted to be a doctor. Not for the money. He'd seen enough of our neighbors struggle with health problems they couldn't afford to treat." Miguel moved to the windows, looking out at the glittering city below. "I worked 3 jobs to put him through college, then medical school, cleaning offices at night, construction during the day, weekend security at a hospital. I barely slept for 8 years, but it was worth it. Every sacrifice was worth it, because I was building something bigger than myself." Victoria found herself leaning forward, drawn into the quiet power of his words. He graduated top of his class from Mount Sinai, had offers from hospitals across the country, research positions that would have made him famous, made him rich. Miguel turned back to her, and she saw something break behind his eyes. "But Danny? He chose to work in a free clinic in East Harlem. Said he wanted to help people who reminded him of the neighborhood where he grew up." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken loss. "What happened to him?" Miguel's hands found the small object in his pocket, the same thing she'd seen him holding the night before. "Gang shooting. Wrong place, wrong time." Danny was working late at the clinic, trying to save a kid who'd been caught in crossfire. The shooters came back, thought the clinic was harboring witnesses. His voice remained steady, but Victoria could see the effort it took. "My son died trying to protect his patients. Took 3 bullets meant for a 16-year-old girl who reminded him of his cousin. Victoria felt something crack open in her chest, a sensation so unfamiliar it took her a moment to recognize it as genuine grief. Not her grief, but an echo of his, reflected back through decades of careful endurance. "I'm sorry. After the funeral, all these important people came up to me. Hospital administrators, politicians, other doctors. They all said the same thing: what a waste. Such a brilliant mind, such a promising career, thrown away on people who couldn't even pay their bills." Miguel pulled the small object from his pocket, cradling it in his open palm. It was a metal bronze star suspended from a ribbon striped in red, white, and blue. They didn't understand. Danny didn't throw his life away. He spent it. Every day he worked in that clinic, he was spending his brilliance and his compassion on people the world had written off. People like me. Victoria stared at the medal, recognition dawning slowly. "That's a Medal of Honor." "Congressional Medal of Honor," Miguel corrected gently. "Awarded posthumously for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." The citation had been read at a ceremony she'd never attended, in a part of the city she'd never visited, honoring a man whose name she'd never known. But sitting in her office, surrounded by her own awards and accolades, Victoria understood with crystalline clarity that she was looking at something that dwarfed every recognition she'd ever received. "The president gave it to you? At the White House?" "Full ceremony, honor guard, the works." Miguel's thumb traced the medal's edge with practiced tenderness. "Afterward, at the reception, I met other recipients. Vietnam veterans, Iraq war heroes, men and women who'd faced down enemy fire to save their brothers." He looked up at her, and she saw tears he refused to let fall. "They welcomed me like family." Said Danny was a different kind of soldier, fighting a different kind of war, but his courage was just as real, his sacrifice just as worthy. Victoria couldn't speak. The words that had always come so easily, the sharp observations, the cutting dismissals, the casual cruelties that maintained her distance from the world, all of them had abandoned her. "So when you ask what changed my mind about success," Miguel continued, returning the medal to his pocket with ceremonial care, "it was learning the difference between being important and being significant, between mattering to yourself and mattering to the world." He resumed his cleaning, moving to dust the shelves where Victoria's own awards stood in formation like soldiers. "I could have been bitter. Could have spent the rest of my life angry at a world that took my son and left me with nothing but a medal and memories." He paused in front of a Forbes cover featuring Victoria's photograph. "But Danny taught me that the size of your impact isn't measured by the size of your office or your bank account. It's measured by how many lives you touch, how much better you leave the world than you found it." Victoria watched him work, this man she'd dismissed as invisible, as insignificant. A man whose son had died a hero, while she'd spent the same years accumulating wealth and isolation. A man who cleaned her office with the same dignity his son had brought to saving lives. "Why do you still work here?" Miguel smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Because honest work has its own dignity. Because every job done well, no matter how small, contributes to something larger. And because—" He hesitated, then seemed to decide on honesty. "Because I meet people, all kinds of people. And sometimes, if I'm patient enough, if I pay attention, I get to see them remember their own humanity." The words hit her like a physical blow. She thought of all the times she'd walked past him, through him, as if he were no more substantial than air. All the conversations she'd never had, the names she'd never learned, the lives she'd never acknowledged. "You think I've forgotten mine?" Miguel considered the question with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "I think you've built walls so high you can't see over them anymore. I think you've confused isolation with strength, accumulation with achievement." He returned to his dusting, speaking without looking at her. "But I don't think it's too late. Danny used to say the hardest patients to treat were the ones who'd forgotten they could heal." He finished his work in contemplative silence, packing his supplies with the same methodical precision he'd brought to the cleaning. Victoria sat motionless, feeling as if something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of her understanding. Miguel? He paused at her door, cart positioned for departure. Your son, would he be proud of what you're doing now? The question seemed to surprise him. He thought for a long moment, his hand unconsciously moving to the metal in his pocket. I hope so. I try to honor his memory by seeing the value in every person I meet, no matter how invisible they might seem to the world. He met her eyes directly, even the ones who've forgotten how to see themselves clearly. After he left, Victoria remained at her desk, staring out at the city that had always represented conquest and achievement. Tonight, it looked different. Not smaller exactly, but more complex. Each light in each window represented a life, a story, a collection of dreams and losses, and small dignities she'd never bothered to consider. She opened her laptop and began typing, not quarterly projections or market analyses, but something she hadn't written in years, a personal note. The cursor blinked on the empty screen like a heartbeat, waiting for words that might bridge the chasm between who she'd become and who she might still choose to be. Victoria didn't sleep that night. She sat in her penthouse, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that transformed Manhattan into a glittering constellation, and tried to write the note she'd started in her office. Every attempt felt inadequate, too formal, too casual, too presumptuous, too distant. How do you apologize for 3 years of willful blindness? How do you acknowledge someone you've spent decades learning not to see? Dawn found her still at her desk, watching the city wake up 40 stories below. From this height, the morning commuters looked like cells moving through arteries, each one carrying invisible stories of purpose and struggle and quiet heroism she'd never bothered to imagine. She thought about Miguel's son, Danny. A brilliant young doctor who'd chosen service over success, who'd measured his worth not in salary but in lives saved, in pain eased, in hope restored to the hopeless. She thought about the Medal of Honor, cradled in an old man's weathered hands like a fragment of sacred text. And she thought about her own awards, lined up in her office like trophies from a game whose rules she was no longer sure she understood. By the time she arrived at Sterling Industries that morning, Victoria had made another decision that would have surprised her yesterday. She took the elevator not to the 42nd floor, but to the building management offices on the 15th. James Rodriguez, the facilities manager, looked up from his computer with barely concealed surprise. In 7 years of managing the building, Victoria Sterling had never once visited his office. Miss Sterling, what can I do for you? I want to know about Miguel Vasquez. Rodriguez's expression shifted from surprise to wariness. Is there a problem? Because Miguel is one of our best. No problem. I want to understand his background, his employment history. Rodriguez hesitated, clearly uncertain about sharing personnel details with someone who technically wasn't Miguel's employer, but wielded enough influence to end careers with a phone call. I can tell you he's been with us for 7 years, always on time, never misses a shift unless he's covering for someone else. Employees respect him, tenants never complain. Before that? Before that? Rodriguez consulted his computer screen. Construction work mostly. Some security. He came to us after. He paused, reading more carefully. After his son died. Listed as next of kin for Dr. Daniel Vasquez. Victoria felt the now familiar tightness in her chest. Dr. Daniel Vasquez. You knew him? I'm learning about him. Rodriguez's expression softened. Miguel doesn't talk about it much, but from what I understand, his son was some kind of hero. Died trying to protect patients at a clinic in East Harlem. Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. Really? Rodriguez looked genuinely surprised. Miguel never mentioned that. He's not one to talk about himself. Victoria spent the rest of the morning making calls she'd never thought to make before. To the White House personnel office, where a helpful staffer confirmed the details of Daniel Vasquez's medal ceremony. To Mount Sinai Medical School, where the dean spoke with reverence about their most promising graduate who'd chosen public service over private practice. To the Esperanza Free Clinic in East Harlem, where Daniel had worked until the night he died. Each conversation painted the same picture. A young man of extraordinary talent who dedicated his life to serving the most vulnerable members of society. A doctor who'd treated gunshot wounds and overdoses with the same careful attention he'd given to his medical school examinations. A son who'd learned about dignity and service from a father who cleaned office buildings and considered it honest work worth doing well. That evening, Victoria waited in her office until she heard the familiar rattle of Miguel's cart. When he knocked, she was ready. "Come in, Miguel, please." He entered with his usual careful dignity, but she could sense his wariness. Their conversation the night before had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "I have something for you." Victoria stood and walked to her desk, where she'd placed a manila folder thick with documents. Miguel watched her approach with the same patient attention he brought to everything else. "I spent the day learning about your son." Miguel's hands stilled on his cart handle. "Ms. Sterling, please let me finish." She opened the folder, revealing printed emails, official documents, and several photographs she'd found in the public record. "I spoke with Dr. Martinez at Mount Sinai. He said Daniel was the most gifted student he'd taught in 30 years of medicine. Full scholarships to Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Stanford all declined so he could stay close to home and serve his community." Miguel's breath caught almost imperceptibly. "I spoke with Maria Santos, the current director of the Esperanza Free Clinic. She said they still talk about Dr. Danny, how he'd work 18-hour shifts without complaint, how he'd pay for patients' medications out of his own pocket when they couldn't afford them." Victoria pulled out a photograph Daniel in his white coat, stethoscope around his neck, standing beside a mural of hope painted on the clinic's wall. "And I spoke with Carmen Rodriguez, no relation to your coworker, the 16-year-old girl your son died protecting. She's 23 now, a nursing student at Hunter College. She told me she thinks about him every day, how he threw himself between her and the gunman without hesitation." Miguel's composure finally cracked. Tears he'd held back for years began to fall, silent and steady. "She wanted me to tell you something," Victoria continued, her own voice thick with emotion she'd rarely allowed herself to feel. "She said Dr. Danny told her, while he was working on her wounds, that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to act in spite of fear because someone needs you to." She closed the folder and placed it in Miguel's trembling hands. "Your son didn't just save Carmen's life that night. She became a nurse because of him. She volunteers at the clinic where he died, treating patients who have nowhere else to turn. She's studying to become a pediatric nurse practitioner so she can work with children who remind her of herself at 16. Miguel clutched the folder to his chest, his shoulders shaking with the weight of grief finally given permission to breathe. "One life," Victoria whispered. "One choice to serve instead of profit, to heal instead of accumulate. And the ripples are still spreading, still touching lives your son will never know about." She returned to her desk and withdrew something from the top drawer, check, written on her personal account. "The Esperanza Free Clinic needs funding for a new pediatric wing. Carmen told me they've been trying to raise money for 3 years. Miguel looked at the check, his eyes widening at the amount. $5 million. Enough to build and equip a state-of-the-art children's medical facility. "I can't. It's not for you, it's for them. The children who need what your son spent his life providing." Victoria paused, then added quietly, "There's one condition." Miguel waited. "I want it called the Dr. Daniel Vasquez Pediatric Center. I want his name on the wall, his story told to every medical student who rotates through. I want the world to know what real success looks like." Miguel sank into the chair across from her desk, overwhelmed by the gesture and its implications. "Why?" he whispered. "After all this time, why now?" Victoria considered the question, thinking about the woman she'd been just 48 hours ago armored in indifference, insulated by wealth, measuring her worth by the distance she could maintain from ordinary human need. "Because you were right, I had forgotten how to see. I'd built my life around the illusion that success meant rising above everyone else, that maturity meant caring about fewer and fewer things." She moved to the window, looking out at the city that no longer seemed like a conquest to be claimed. "But your son understood something I'd lost." that the only success worth having is the kind that lifts others up with you. She turned back to Miguel, who was studying the photograph of Daniel with the tender attention of someone memorizing a sacred text. I want to do better, not because it will make me feel good about myself, but because there's work to be done and I finally understand that my resources come with responsibilities I've been ignoring. Miguel looked up at her with something she'd never seen in anyone's eyes when they looked at her before. Not deference or envy or calculation, but simple human recognition. The look of one person truly seeing another. "Danny would have liked you," he said softly. "I wish I could have met him. You can still honor him, not just with money, though that will help, but by remembering what he taught me, that every person you meet is carrying something precious, even if they've forgotten it themselves." Victoria nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into the places where her cynicism used to live. "Miguel?" "Yes? Would you teach me how to see the way you do, how to notice the people I've been walking past?" Miguel smiled, the same real smile she'd glimpsed the night before, but warmer now, touched with something that might have been hope. "It's not something you learn in a day. It takes practice, patience. You have to be willing to be wrong about people, to discover that your first impressions were just shadows of the truth. I have time. And you have to be willing to be changed by what you see. Once you start really looking at people, really listening to their stories, you can't go back to the comfort of not caring." Victoria thought about the woman she'd been, the careful isolation she'd cultivated, the walls she'd built to keep the world's pain at a manageable distance. "I don't want to go back." Miguel stood slowly, the folder still clutched against his chest like armor made of love and memory. "Then we start tomorrow, but not here, not in this tower. If you really want to learn how to see, you have to go where the people are." As he prepared to leave, Victoria realized she had one more question. "Miguel? That first night, when you said I'd never looked at you, why did you finally speak up?" He paused at the door, considering. "Because I saw something in your eyes I recognized. The same look Danny had when he was struggling with a difficult case, when he knew something was wrong but couldn't quite identify what it was." Miguel's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd learned to trust his instincts about human nature. "I thought maybe you were ready to start looking for answers." After he left, Victoria remained at her desk, but she wasn't working. She was thinking about tomorrow, about stepping outside the familiar boundaries of her carefully controlled world. For the first time in decades, she was thinking about becoming someone she didn't yet know how to be. The Esperanza Free Clinic sat wedged between a bodega and a laundromat on East 116th Street, its modest storefront bearing no resemblance to the gleaming medical facilities Victoria was accustomed to visiting. The building's brick facade had been painted a hopeful yellow that had faded with time and weather, and the small sign announcing "Clínica Gratuita Esperanza, Free Medical Care," hung slightly crooked above glass doors marked with children's handprints. Victoria stood on the sidewalk at 6 a.m., wearing jeans and a simple sweater that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, but looked appropriately understated. She'd never worn jeans to anything work-related, had never stood on a street corner in East Harlem, had never voluntarily placed herself somewhere she couldn't control the variables. Miguel appeared from around the corner, moving with his familiar, careful gait, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the bodega. "You came. I said I would." He handed her one of the cups, steam rising in the cool morning air. "This isn't a photo opportunity, Miss Sterling. No reporters, no tax write-offs, no board meetings where you get to talk about your charitable work. I understand. Do you?" Miguel's question was gentle but penetrating, because the people in there, they can smell insincerity from a mile away. They've been disappointed by enough politicians and do-gooders to know the difference between someone who wants to help and someone who wants to feel good about helping. Victoria sipped the coffee stronger and more, bitter than anything she usually drank, but somehow more honest too. "What do I need to know?" "That you're not here to save anyone. You're here to learn, to listen, to understand that every person who walks through those doors has a story worth hearing, a dignity worth respecting, and wisdom you've never encountered in any boardroom. The clinic doors opened, and a woman in scrubs emerged, late 40s, tired eyes, hands that moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to treating serious problems with limited resources. "Miguel, early today," she noticed Victoria, her expression shifting to polite wariness. "And you brought a friend?" "Dr. Maria Santos. This is Victoria Sterling." "Victoria, Dr. Santos runs the clinic." Recognition flickered across Dr. Santos's face. Victoria saw the moment when her name registered, when the doctor connected her to the check that had arrived yesterday with instructions to begin planning the pediatric wing. "Miss Sterling." Dr. Santos extended her hand, her grip firm and measuring. "Thank you for your donation. It will save lives." "I hope so. I know so. We see 60 children a week here. Asthma, diabetes, injuries that won't heal properly because families can't afford follow-up care. Your funding means we can finally give them the specialized treatment they deserve." Dr. Santos led them into the clinic, through a waiting room already beginning to fill despite the early hour. Victoria saw families speaking in Spanish and English, elderly men reading newspapers in languages she couldn't identify, children playing quietly with toys that had been donated and repaired many times over. "This was Daniel's world," Miguel said quietly as they passed the reception desk. He knew every patient's name, every family's story. He treated them not as cases or conditions, but as people who'd trusted him with their most precious possession, their health. They entered a small office behind the reception area where Dr. Santos poured coffee from a pot that had seen better decades. "I worked alongside Daniel for 2 years," she said, settling into a chair behind a desk crowded with patient files and medical journals. He could have worked anywhere, Mass General, Cleveland Clinic, any research hospital in the country, but he chose to be here. "Why?" Victoria asked. "Because this is where he was needed most. Because he understood that medicine isn't just about treating disease, it's about treating human beings with dignity and compassion, regardless of their ability to pay." Dr. Santos pulled out a worn photograph from her desk drawer. "He used to say that every patient teaches you something, but the patients who have the least to give often teach you the most." The photograph showed Daniel in the clinic's main examination room, kneeling beside a young boy who couldn't have been more than 6. The child was laughing at something Daniel had said, and the doctor's face showed the kind of joy that comes from work that feeds the soul. "That's Roberto," Dr. Santos continued. "Severe asthma, parents who worked 3 jobs between them but still couldn't afford his medications. Daniel not only treated him for free but drove to Roberto's school to train his teachers in emergency procedures." Victoria studied the photograph, seeing past the medical equipment and institutional lighting to something more fundamental, the profound attention one human being was paying to another, the sacred transaction of healing taking place in a space most of the world had forgotten. "Roberto's in high school now," Dr. Santos added. "Wants to be a doctor. Says Dr. Danny showed him that medicine is about more than science, it's about love in action." Miguel stood at the window, looking out at the neighborhood where his son had chosen to spend his brilliant mind and compassionate heart. "After Daniel died, I thought about closing the clinic," Dr. Santos admitted. "The violence, the lack of resources, the constant struggle to keep the doors open, it felt impossible without him. But then I realized that quitting would dishonor everything he'd worked for. So you stayed. We all stayed. Every nurse, every volunteer, every medical student who'd rotated through here and caught Daniel's vision of what healthcare could be." Dr. Santos gestured toward the waiting room, where the morning's first patients were being called back for treatment. "We stayed because this community needs us, and because Daniel taught us that need creates obligation, especially for those of us with the skills to respond." Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation that her understanding of the world was being quietly, irrevocably restructured. "Can I ask you something, Dr. Santos?" "Of course. When you look at what I do, what Sterling Industries does, the products we make, the profits we generated, you see any connection to what you do here?" Dr. Santos considered the question with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to choose her words wisely. I see resources that could change lives if they were directed toward human need instead of just human want." She paused, then added, "But I also see someone asking the right questions, which is often where meaningful change begins." A knock at the door interrupted them. A young nurse leaned in, speaking rapid Spanish to Dr. Spanish. Santos, who nodded and stood immediately. "We have a situation. Miguel, would you mind showing Miss Sterling around while I handle this?" After Santos left, Miguel led Victoria through the clinic's modest facilities. They passed examination rooms where volunteer doctors treated everything from routine checkups to emergency conditions, a small pharmacy where medications were dispensed regardless of patients' ability to pay, and a children's area where toy cars and coloring books provided distraction from the anxiety of medical visits. "This is where it happened," Miguel said quietly, stopping in a hallway that led to the clinic's back entrance. Victoria realized they were standing where Daniel had died, where he'd made the split-second decision to shield his patients from gunfire instead of protecting himself. The police said he could have escaped. There was a window in the back room, an exit he knew about. But he stayed because 3 patients were still in the clinic, Carmen and 2 others who'd been hit in the crossfire. Miguel's voice carried the weight of a story he'd reconstructed from police reports and witness statements, a father's need to understand his son's final moments. When the shooters came back, looking for witnesses, Daniel put himself between them and the patients. The first bullet hit him in the shoulder, but he kept moving, kept shielding them. The second caught him in the chest, and he went down, but he was still conscious, still giving medical instructions to Carmen about how to apply pressure to her wounds. Victoria closed her eyes, imagining the senile young doctor choosing others' lives over his own, using his final moments to teach a teenager how to save herself. The third bullet. Miguel's voice broke slightly. The third bullet was meant for Carmen. Daniel pulled himself up, put his body in front of her one last time. They stood in silence, the clinic's everyday sounds, phones ringing, conversations in multiple languages, children's laughter creating a living memorial to a man who'd understood that some things are worth dying for. "I used to be angry," Miguel continued. "At God, at the world, at the randomness of violence that takes good people while leaving others untouched. But anger didn't honor Daniel's choice. Anger didn't serve the community he'd died protecting. What did? This," Miguel gestured at the clinic around them, "continuing his work, making sure his vision of healthcare as a human right, not a privilege, stayed alive. And teaching people like you that success isn't about how much you accumulate, it's about how much you contribute." They returned to the waiting room, where Victoria found herself really looking at the people Miguel had tried to teach her to see. An elderly woman holding a prescription she probably couldn't afford to fill. A young mother comforting a crying baby while trying to manage 2 other children. A construction worker cradling his injured hand, still in work clothes because he couldn't afford to miss a full day's pay. Each person represented a story, a struggle, a collection of hopes and fears and small dignities that Victoria had spent decades training herself not to notice. "Miguel? Yes? I want to fund more than just the pediatric wing. I want to establish an endowment that ensures this clinic never has to worry about basic operating expenses again." Miguel studied her face, looking for signs of the performative charity that wealthy people sometimes use to purchase absolution for their indifference. That would change everything. But money isn't the only thing they need. What else? Time, attention. The kind of sustained commitment that doesn't make headlines but makes a difference. Miguel paused, then added, "Daniel used to say that the poor don't need saviors, they need partners. People who'll show up not just when it's convenient or photogenic, but when the work is hard and the progress is slow." Victoria looked around the waiting room again, seeing it not as a site for brief charitable intervention, but as a place where she might learn to become someone she'd never thought to be. "Would you teach me how to show up?" Miguel's smile was answer enough. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Santos reappeared, looking tired but satisfied. "Crisis averted. Miguel, tell Miss Sterling about the board meeting next week." "Board meeting?" The clinic is run by a community board, Miguel explained. Local residents, patients, volunteers, people who understand what this place means because they depend on it. They meet monthly to make decisions about programs, priorities, spending. Would you like to attend? Dr. Santos asked. Not as a donor making demands, but as someone learning how community-based healthcare actually works. Victoria felt a flutter of nervousness she hadn't experienced since her first corporate presentation decades ago. Would they want me there? If you come with the right intentions, Dr. Santos replied. If you come ready to listen more than you speak, to learn more than you teach. Walking back to Miguel's car, Victoria realized that something fundamental had shifted in the past few hours. The city looked different from street level, more complex, more human, more real than it ever had from 42 floors up. Miguel? Yes? When Daniel was dying, what did he say? Were there any last words? Miguel was quiet for so long that Victoria thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Carmen said he told her to remember that everyone she met would be fighting a battle she knew nothing about. He said the only way to honor the life she'd been given was to help others fight their battles with dignity. Victoria nodded, understanding that she'd been given more than a lesson in humility. She'd been given a blueprint for becoming someone worthy of the resources she'd been trusted with. Someone Daniel Vasquez might have been proud to know. 6 months later, Victoria sat in a folding metal chair in the basement of St. Mark's Lutheran Church, surrounded by 23 residents of East Harlem who'd agreed to let her join the monthly board meeting of the Esperanza Free Clinic. The basement smelled of coffee and determination, its cinder-block walls decorated with children's drawings and community announcements in English and Spanish. She was no longer the woman who'd dismissed Miguel as invisible. That woman had worn armor made of indifference and isolation. This woman, still learning, still struggling to see clearly, wore jeans and a wool sweater, carried a notebook instead of a tablet, and had spent the morning helping to stock the clinic's new pediatric pharmacy. Let's start with Dr. Santos's report, said Elena Rodriguez, the board chair, a woman in her 70s who'd raised 5 children while working as a hospital custodian and now volunteered 40 hours a week at the clinic. Dr. Santos stood, consulting notes written on the back of a patient form. Good news first, the Vasquez Pediatric Center opened its doors last week. We've already seen 42 children, including 17 who'd been on our waiting list for specialist care. Murmurs of approval rippled through the basement. Victoria felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or tax benefits and everything to do with Roberto, the boy with asthma she'd met on her first visit, who'd been among the pediatric center's first patients. Challenges? Elena prompted. Always the same. We need more bilingual nurses, more mental health support, more funding for medications that aren't covered by any assistance programs. Dr. Santos glanced at Victoria. And we need to start planning for sustainability beyond our current major donors' contributions. Victoria had learned, over months of these meetings, that her role was to listen more than speak, to ask questions rather than provide answers, to remember that the people in this room understood their community's needs better than any outside expert ever could. But she'd also learned when her voice was needed. I've been talking with pharmaceutical companies about establishing a regional drug access program, she said quietly. Bristol Myers Squibb is interested in piloting a program here, using the clinic as a model for affordable medication distribution in underserved communities. That would be huge, Dr. Santos replied. But these companies, they make promises, then disappear when the media attention fades. Not this time. Victoria opened her notebook, consulting details she'd memorized, but wrote down anyway to show respect for the process. I'm putting up a $10 million guarantee fund. If they pull out early, the money covers the program for 5 years while we find alternative suppliers. Elena leaned forward. You're risking your own money to make sure a pharmaceutical company keeps its word? I'm investing in proving that community-based healthcare can work at scale. Victoria paused, choosing her words carefully. But more than that, I'm honoring a promise I made to Miguel and to Daniel's memory. Miguel, who'd been silent in his customary back corner seat, spoke for the first time that evening. Daniel used to say that sustainable change requires sustainable commitment, that you can't parachute into communities with solutions and expect them to last after you leave. He looked at Victoria with something that might have been pride. Victoria's learning the difference between charity and justice. The meeting continued for another hour, covering everything from volunteer scheduling to a proposal for a mobile health unit that could serve patients who couldn't make it to the clinic. Victoria contributed when asked, deferred when appropriate, and took notes about problems that might benefit from resources or connections she could provide quietly, without fanfare. After the meeting, she found herself walking through the neighborhood with Miguel, past bodegas where she now knew the owners' names, past apartment buildings where clinic patients lived with dignity despite circumstances that would have seemed impossible to navigate from her former perspective. "You've changed," Miguel observed as they paused at a corner where Daniel used to buy coffee before his shifts. "Have I? Or have I just stopped pretending?" "Maybe both." They watched a group of teenagers playing basketball on a court where someone had painted a mural of Daniel in his white coat, stethoscope around his neck, hands reaching toward children who'd gathered around him like flowers turning toward sunlight. "Carmen organized that," Miguel said, nodding toward the mural. "She's finishing her nursing program next month, already accepted a position at the pediatrics center." Victoria smiled, thinking about the 16-year-old girl whose life Daniel had saved, who'd grown into a young woman determined to save others in return. The ripples keep spreading. They always do. Good and bad, the choices we make echo forward in ways we can't predict or control. Miguel pulled his jacket tighter against the October wind. "But Daniel taught me that if you make enough good choices, if you plant enough seeds of kindness and justice, eventually the garden takes on a life of its own." They continued walking, past the community center where Victoria now helped teach financial literacy classes, past the elementary school where she'd funded an after-school program that provided both homework help and healthy meals, past small businesses that had reopened thanks to microloans from a fund she'd established with no expectation of profit or recognition. "Miguel?" "Yes?" "That night in my office, when you first confronted me, did you know it would lead to this?" Miguel considered the question with his characteristic care. "I knew you were asking the wrong questions. I hoped you might be ready for better ones." "What made you think I was ready?" "Because you stayed late to work. Because you cared enough about something, even if it was just quarterly profit sacrifice your comfort for it." Miguel paused outside the clinic, where lights still burned in the night shift examination rooms. "I figured if you could care that much about numbers on a screen, you might be capable of caring about people in the world." Victoria looked up at the clinic's modest sign, thinking about all the lives that had been saved and healed within those walls, all the stories of struggle and resilience that had unfolded in examination rooms and waiting areas. "I've been thinking about Sterling Industries," she said quietly, "about how to restructure it, how to use its resources for something beyond profit maximization. And I want to establish a foundation focused on community-based healthcare, not just funding clinics, but training local leaders, supporting medical students who commit to serving underserved areas, developing technologies that make quality healthcare accessible regardless of economic status." Miguel nodded slowly. "Daniel would approve. But what about your board of directors, your shareholders? The people who've benefited from your company's focus on profit?" Victoria had been wrestling with these questions for months, knowing that transforming Sterling Industries would require more than good intentions. It would require strategic thinking, careful planning, and the courage to disappoint people who'd grown wealthy from the status quo. "Some of them will fight me. Some will sell their shares rather than support a mission-driven company. But I've learned something about the difference between being liked and being respected, between short-term gains and long-term value." She turned to face Miguel directly. "I've also learned that I'd rather fail at something meaningful than succeed at something hollow." Miguel's smile carried the warmth of someone who'd watched another person discover their own capacity for courage. "There's something I want to show you," he said. leading her around to the clinic's back entrance, the same hallway where Daniel had made his final stand. The wall that had once been marked by bullet holes now displayed a memorial that took Victoria's breath away. Bronze plaques honored not just Daniel, but dozens of other community members who died serving others: teachers, social workers, volunteers, ordinary people who'd made extraordinary choices. At the center, larger than the rest, was Daniel's plaque. But beneath his name and dates, instead of the expected eulogy, were words that captured everything Victoria had learned about the difference between success and significance. Dr. Daniel Vasquez understood that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you contribute, not what you achieve for yourself, but what you make possible for others. He lived as if every person mattered, and in dying, proved that some things matter more than living. Below that, in smaller text, dedicated by his father, Miguel Vasquez, and his friend, Victoria Sterling, who learned from Daniel that the only wealth worth having is the wealth you share. Victoria stared at the plaque, particularly the words, his friend. Miguel had included her in Daniel's legacy, had declared her worthy of connection to a man she'd never met, but whose influence had fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life. Miguel, I don't deserve. You don't get to decide what you deserve, Miguel interrupted gently. You only get to decide what you do with what you've been given. And you've chosen to do something Daniel would have been proud of. They stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd found their way to friendship across a chasm of class and circumstance, united by their commitment to honoring a young doctor's vision of a more just world. There's one more thing, Miguel said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a small box, worn velvet faded to gray. Inside was a second medal, not Daniel's Medal of Honor, but something simpler. A small bronze disc engraved with words Victoria had to lean closer to read, "For courage in the face of truth." I had this made, Miguel explained, not for any official ceremony, not for any public recognition, just for someone who had the courage to see herself clearly and choose to become someone better. Victoria accepted the medal with trembling hands, understanding that it represented something more valuable than any award she'd ever received, the recognition of someone whose opinion she'd learned to value more than the applause of crowds or the approval of peers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you," Miguel replied, "for showing an old man that it's never too late to plant seeds, never too late to watch someone grow into who they were meant to be." As they prepared to part ways, Miguel to his modest apartment where he kept Daniel's Medal of Honor on the kitchen table like a daily reminder of what love looks like in action. Victoria to her penthouse, where she'd spend the evening drafting plans to transform her company into something worthy of the trust she'd been given. The October wind carried the sounds of a city settling into evening. Somewhere in the darkness, Carmen was finishing her shift at the pediatric center, checking on children whose lives had been saved by a foundation built on one young doctor's sacrifice. Somewhere, Roberto was studying for his medical school entrance exams, motivated by memories of a doctor who'd seen him not as a poor kid with asthma, but as a human being deserving of dignity and care. And somewhere, in the space between what had been and what might yet become, Daniel Vasquez's vision of a world where everyone mattered continued to grow, tended by people who'd learned that the only success worth pursuing is the kind that blooms long after you're gone. Miguel's hand touched the medal in his pocket, his son's Medal of Honor, a father's reminder that true heroism isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as choosing to see clearly, as simple as deciding to care, as revolutionary as treating every person you meet as if their life has meaning. And sometimes it's as ordinary and extraordinary as an old janitor teaching a wealthy woman how to look at the world with eyes wide enough to see the honor hidden in plain sight.